So, more than 60% of toddlers, specifically between the ages of 2 and 5, consume an active central nervous system stimulant every single day.
It's honestly a staggering statistic when you look at it purely pharmacologically.
Right, and no one hides it. I mean, the parents actively purchase it for them. It's completely legal. It's deeply embedded in our culture and, entirely normalized. Today, we're looking at the world's ultimate diagnostic blind spot.
We really are. And to frame our approach today, I want to borrow this brilliant conceptual anchor from our sources. We're going to act as clinical detectives.
I like that.
Yeah. So imagine an investigator, let's call him Medlock Holmes, who is observing the morning routine of a major city. Office lights flicker on, kettles are whistling in the dark.
Students clutching their steaming mugs.
Exactly. Doctors starting ward rounds with takeaway cups. And Holmes notes that, unlike the illicit drugs he's tracked before, this substance is celebrated. It's offered to guests. And yet he is completely puzzled.
Well, his puzzle is essentially the core question for this deep dive. How can the world's most socially accepted psychoactive substance also be capable of, profound intoxication, withdrawal, severe anxiety, insomnia, physical dependence, and genuine addiction?
Precisely. His newest investigation begins not at a crime scene, but in a cafe.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are acting as your companion to Chapter 11.4 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry. And our mission isn't just to list textbook facts.
No, definitely not.
We're here to synthesize, to clarify mechanisms and build a robust mental model of how psychiatrists actually evaluate caffeine-related disorders.
And doing that synthesis requires us to view this through a very specific lens. I mean, psychiatry at its core is the study of how the brain, the mind, and human experience interact.
And how that process can go wrong.
Exactly. And caffeine is arguably the ultimate everyday test case for this interaction. Because it's so seamlessly woven into daily life, both patients and clinicians rarely stop to examine its pharmacological impact. We have this massive collective cultural blind spot.
I was actually looking at the epidemiological data in the chapter, and the sheer scale of consumption is what creates that blind spot, isn't it?
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, we're talking about the most widely used mood-altering drug globally. Roughly 90% of adults in the U.S. consume it regularly.
And it's not just coffee. It's found naturally in over 60 species of plants. Tea, yerba mate, cacao, and it's synthetically added to medications, dietary supplements, and foods.
But going back to that toddler statistic for a second, how on earth did a known central nervous system stimulant become a standard childhood beverage?
Well, to understand that, Medlock Holmes would have to look at the historical and economic vectors, that carried caffeine into the modern era.
Right, the history is fascinating.
It really is. Its integration spans millennia, obviously starting with tea cultivation in China over 2,000 years ago. But the explosion really happened when coffee spread from Ethiopia to Arabia in the 15th century.
And then into Europe in the 17th century, right?
Spot on. And what's interesting is how the medical literature of the time treated it. It wasn't just a nice warm drink. It was actively promoted for various conditions, mostly because of its ability to induce sobriety and clarity.
Which makes a lot of sense when you think about what people were drinking before coffee arrived.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I was reading about the shift in Europe from ale houses to coffee houses.
Yeah.
Before coffee and tea were widely available, the standard daily drink, even for children, was often weak beer or ale.
Because the water simply wasn't safe to drink.
Right, so you had an entire population basically operating on a mild depressant all day long. And then the coffee houses open, and they swap a depressant for a potent stimulant.
The intellectual tenor of entire cities must have changed practically overnight.
It must have been wild.
It was a profound societal shift. By the early 17th century, London alone had something like 3,000 coffee houses. And these weren't just cafes, they were the absolute hubs of intellectual and commercial discourse.
They called them penny universities, didn't they?
Yes. The most famous being Edward Lloyd's Coffee House. It was this gathering place for sailors and merchants, which organically birthed the maritime insurance industry. That became Lloyd's of London.
Wow. So caffeine quite literally fueled the infrastructure of modern global commerce.
It really did.
And in the U.S., that shift from tea to coffee was actually highly political. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 wasn't just a protest against taxation. It initiated a permanent cultural shift. Drinking coffee became an act of patriotism.
Exactly. And fast forward to today, coffee is inextricably linked to the global economy. For developing nations, only crude oil produces more foreign exchange earnings than coffee.
That is wild. Second only to crude oil. When a psychoactive substance is that economically valuable, its ubiquity is absolutely guaranteed.
It guarantees ubiquity, but it also drives continuous market innovation, which answers your question about the toddlers.
The soft drinks.
Right. While brewed coffee dominates adult consumption, the industry needed other vectors. By the late 19th century, caffeine started appearing in soft drinks. Manufacturers often defend it as a flavoring agent, saying it adds a slight bitterness.
But there's very little scientific evidence for that, right?
Practically none at the concentrations they use. Its primary function is central nervous system stimulation and habituation.
Which brings us to the most volatile shift recently, the energy drink era. Red Bull launched in the U.S. in 1997, and the landscape completely changed.
It did, and the clinical implications here are genuinely alarming. The chapter points out that sales of energy drinks more than doubled just between 2014 and 2021.
And there's a major regulatory loophole allowing this, right?
Yes, a massive one. Because many of these drinks and concentrated shots are marketed as dietary supplements, they bypass the much stricter FDA regulations that govern traditional pharmaceuticals and food additives.
That's a critical detail for clinicians to know.
Absolutely. It allows manufacturers to deliver massive, highly concentrated doses of caffeine, often masked by huge amounts of sugar, directly to youth and young adults.
Right, because a traditional cup of hot brewed coffee is sipped slowly. It's hot, it's bitter, so it self-regulates how fast you absorb it.
Precisely. But an energy drink is served ice cold and heavily sweetened. You can consume a massive dose of an active pharmaceutical agent in seconds.
So, given this environment saturated with the drug, how does the psychiatric nosology, the diagnostic classification, actually handle it? Because if everyone takes a drug, pathologizing it becomes really controversial.
That tension is brilliantly reflected in how our diagnostic manuals have evolved. If you look at the trajectory from 1980 to now, you see the psychiatric community slowly grappling with the reality of caffeine.
The DSM-3 only recognized caffeine intoxication, right?
Exactly. It essentially just said, if you take a massive overdose, you'll get sick. But it completely ignored the daily chronic habit.
Right. It acknowledged acute poisoning, but ignored physical dependence or withdrawal.
But as the clinical data mounted, that framework had to expand. By the time we get to the current DSM-5-TR, the manual recognizes multiple formal diagnoses.
Intoxication, withdrawal, induced anxiety disorder, and induced sleep disorder.
Right. And most notably, they included caffeine use disorder in Section 3 as a condition for further study.
Signaling that for a specific subset of people, it produces genuine addiction and impairment.
Yes. And the global perspective is shifting even further. The International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-11, has some nuances the DSM lacks.
I noticed that. They've introduced hazardous use of caffeine and a harmful pattern of use.
Right.
I find hazardous use really interesting because it applies when the pattern of use increases the risk of harm, even if clinical damage hasn't manifested yet. It's a much more preventative lens.
It reflects a growing global consensus that caffeine is a highly potent agent that demands clinical respect. But to truly understand why the manuals are updating, we have to look beneath the epidemiology.
Down to the molecular level.
Exactly. We need to explore the pharmacokinetics, how the body processes the drug, because this is where the variability that confuses so many clinicians originates.
Let's trace that pathway. A patient drinks an espresso. What's the timeline of absorption?
It is remarkably rapid. After ingestion, caffeine is almost completely absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. You're looking at peak plasma concentrations within roughly 30 to 60 minutes.
That's fast.
Very fast. And once in the bloodstream, because it's both water and lipid soluble, it distributes freely across all body fluids. It easily crosses the blood-brain barrier, the placenta, and passes into breast milk.
But the real heavy lifting, the process that determines how long the effects last, that happens in the liver, doesn't it?
That is the absolute crux of caffeine pharmacokinetics. Over 90% of it is metabolized by the liver, specifically by the cytochrome P450 isozyme 1A2.
Which we usually just call CYP1A2.
Right. This enzyme system demethylates the caffeine, breaking it down into 3 primary active metabolites: paraxanthine, theophylline, and theobromine.
I want to pause on those metabolites for a second, because they aren't just inactive waste products. They have their own clinical profiles.
They absolutely do.
For instance, theophylline is a known bronchodilator. We historically used it to treat asthma. And theobromine, which is also in chocolate, acts as a mild vasodilator and diuretic.
A very astute clinical observation.
So when a patient consumes caffeine, they're actually getting this whole cascade of secondary pharmacological effects.
Exactly. That cascade contributes significantly to systemic effects like increased heart rate or needing to use the bathroom. But returning to the parent compound, the average half-life of caffeine is generally cited as 4 to 6 hours.
Right.
However, relying on that average is a major clinical pitfall. The inter-individual variability is just massive.
I actually came up with an analogy for this variability while reading the chapter.
Oh, let's hear it.
Imagine a pharmaceutical rep pitches you a new psychiatric drug, but they have to issue this highly specific warning. Doctor, if your patient smokes cigarettes, this drug will leave their body twice as fast. If your patient takes oral contraceptives, it will stay in their system twice as long.
Oh, wow.
And if they happen to get pregnant by the time they reach their 3rd trimester, it will take more than twice as long for this drug to clear.
That is brilliant. If you heard that, you'd view the drug as incredibly volatile and difficult to dose safely.
I'd view it as a high-risk medication requiring constant monitoring.
Your analogy perfectly captures the reality of caffeine. The environmental and pharmacological interactions are profound. But even beyond those factors, we have to consider the patient's baseline genetic architecture.
Right, the genetics of the liver enzymes.
Yes. The variability in that CYP1A2 enzyme's activity is largely dictated by a genetic polymorphism, specifically an A to C substitution on the gene.
So how does that substitution actually play out in a clinical presentation?
Well, if a patient carries the C allele, they possess what we term a slow metabolizer phenotype. The CYP1A2 enzyme simply works less efficiently. Caffeine stays in their system significantly longer.
And the other side.
Individuals with the AA genotype are fast metabolizers, so you can have 2 patients consume the exact same dose, say a double espresso after dinner, and they experience vastly different profiles based entirely on their DNA.
The fast metabolizer sleeps soundly, and the slow metabolizer is agitated and staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning.
Precisely, which explains why simply asking a patient, "How many cups of coffee do you drink?" is clinically insufficient. 4 cups for a fast metabolizer is a completely different biological exposure than 4 cups for a slow metabolizer.
That makes so much sense. And speaking of clearance rates in vulnerable populations, the data on newborns in the chapter is genuinely shocking.
It is a vital piece of neonatal physiology. In infants, the hepatic enzyme systems, including CYP1A2, are profoundly immature. They don't reach adult levels of function until the infant is roughly 6 months old.
Wow. So if a newborn is exposed to caffeine through breast milk or medical intervention for neonatal apnoea, what is their half-life for clearing it?
It's not 4 to 6 hours. It is an astonishing 80 to 100 hours.
Wait, 80 to 100 hours? That's almost 4 days to clear just half a dose.
Yes. The accumulation potential is immense. It's a fact every clinician and parent should have in their mental model.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've established the pharmacokinetics, how it moves through the body, and how wildly that clearance varies. Let's move to the pharmacodynamics.
Right, what it actually did in the brain.
Exactly. What is it doing to produce alertness? Because this is where our detective, Medlock Holmes, had his great revelation about the engine and the brakes.
This is the most elegant and honestly counterintuitive aspect of the molecule. Intuitively, when we think of a stimulant, we imagine a substance pressing the brain's accelerator pedal, right?
Like dumping excitatory neurotransmitters into the synapses like amphetamines do.
Exactly. But caffeine does not press the accelerator. Its primary mechanism of action at typical human doses is entirely inhibitory. It blocks the brake.
Let's unpack that brake pedal concept neurobiologically. What is the actual physiological brake?
Throughout your waking day, as your neurons fire and expend cellular energy ATP, a molecule called adenosine is produced as a byproduct.
Okay, adenosine.
Right. It acts as an endogenous neuromodulator. You can conceptualize it as a biological metric of cellular exhaustion. As the hours pass, adenosine steadily accumulates in the brain and binds to specific receptors.
Principally the adenosine A1 and A2A receptors, right?
Exactly. And when adenosine binds to those receptors, it generally exerts an inhibitory tone. It reduces spontaneous electrical activity in the neurons. It dilates cerebral blood vessels.
So it basically increases sleep pressure.
Yes, making you feel increasingly tired and lethargic. It's like sand accumulating in the bottom of a daily hourglass.
So enter caffeine. If you look at the molecular structure of caffeine, it is remarkably similar to adenosine, isn't it?
Yes, it is essentially an antagonist masquerading as the natural molecule.
Because of that structural homology, caffeine molecules cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to those exact same A1 and A2A receptors with high affinity.
But and this is the definitive mechanism, they occupy the receptor without activating it. They don't trigger the intracellular cascade that adenosine would.
They take up the seat, but they don't apply the brake.
Precisely. They change the locks on the doors so the adenosine can't get in.
So the endogenous adenosine is still floating around in the synapses. The brain is still technically exhausted, but the receptors are blocked. The biological signal for fatigue is muted.
Just as Holmes noted, the engine was never made stronger. You merely disconnected the brakes.
That is such a vivid way to picture it.
And because that inhibitory tone is removed, the brain's natural excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine are allowed to fire unopposed,
leading to increased arousal and alertness.
Right. But the story doesn't end at the adenosine receptor. To understand why caffeine is reinforcing, why people seek it out beyond just waking up, we have to look at the brain's reward circuitry.
And a phenomenon called receptor heteromerization.
Yes,
Right.
that's
That
right.
is a heavy textbook neurobiology term. Let's translate that into clinical reality for the listener.
It essentially means that different types of receptors on the surface of a neuron can physically link together to form a complex, altering each other's function.
Okay.
In specific regions of the brain, notably the striatum, the adenosine A2A receptor physically forms a heteromeric complex with the dopamine D2 receptor.
And dopamine is obviously a primary neurotransmitter for motivation, attention, and reward.
Exactly. So the brake pedal is physically wired to the reward accelerator. Under normal conditions, when adenosine binds to the A2A receptor, it decreases the binding affinity of that adjacent D2 receptor for dopamine.
It suppresses the reward signal.
Yes. But when caffeine comes in and blocks that A2A receptor, it induces a conformational change in the linked complex. It essentially takes the leash off the dopamine receptor.
Oh, wow. So by blocking the exhaustion signal, caffeine indirectly amplifies dopamine signaling, particularly in areas like the shell of the nucleus accumbens.
Which is a major node in the addiction and reward pathway.
Right, but it doesn't dump massive amounts of dopamine like a classic drug of abuse, which is why it doesn't cause intense euphoria.
Exactly. It just enhances the dopamine that is already there. It's a highly sophisticated chemical heist.
A chemical heist, I love that. And this indirect amplification is what drives the behavioral stimulant properties.
It explains the increase in motivation, the ability to sustain attention on tedious tasks, and crucially, its habit-forming potential.
The pleasurable subjective effects at low to moderate doses: well-being, alertness, sociability.
Yes, around 20 to 200 milligrams. But the problem arises when this elegant mechanism is pushed too far or when the daily ritual is disrupted.
Right, disconnecting the brakes works perfectly for a quick commute. But if you leave them disconnected permanently, eventually the car is going to crash.
Exactly.
Let's move from mechanisms to clinical manifestations. Let's look at the first formal clinical syndrome outlined in the DSM-5-TR, caffeine intoxication. What does acute toxicity actually look like?
It is a discrete, highly uncomfortable syndrome. The criteria typically require recent consumption well in excess of 250 milligrams, though clinical presentations usually involve much higher acute doses.
And the diagnosis requires the presence of 5 or more specific symptoms, right?
Yes, developing during or shortly after use. And importantly, these symptoms must cause clinically significant distress or impairment.
The symptom list in the text reads like a massive sympathetic nervous system overdrive.
It really does.
Patients present with profound restlessness, nervousness, excitement, insomnia, a flushed face, diuresis, meaning they're constantly running to the bathroom,
Gastrointestinal disturbances, muscle twitching, a rambling flow of thought and speech.
tachycardia, inexhaustibility, psychomotor agitation. It sounds remarkably similar to a severe panic attack mixed with a manic episode.
It frequently presents to emergency departments masquerading exactly as those conditions. Patients feel a terrifying loss of physiological control.
Now, while intoxication is common, we have to differentiate it from lethality. We do see alarming headlines occasionally. How much caffeine does it take to actually cause a fatality?
The median lethal dose is generally estimated to be roughly 10 grams for an average adult.
10 grams.
To visualize that, 10 grams is the equivalent of drinking 80 to 100 standard cups of brewed coffee in a very short time frame.
That's a huge volume of liquid.
Exactly. Because of the sheer volume and the fact that high doses usually induce vomiting, fatal overdoses from traditional brewed coffee or tea are exceedingly rare.
But we aren't just drinking brewed coffee anymore, are we?
No, we aren't. When fatalities do occur, they are almost exclusively linked to modern concentrated vectors. We see it with pure anhydrous caffeine powder, often sold as a bulk workout supplement.
Or massive overdoses of concentrated caffeine pills.
Right. A single tablespoon of pure caffeine powder can contain the equivalent of 25 cups of coffee. Accidental lethal overdoses are tragically easy if the product isn't measured with a microscale.
That's terrifying. But severe, clinically significant intoxication doesn't require anywhere near 10 grams. Going back to energy drinks, this is where the regulatory loophole becomes dangerous.
Very dangerous. The Poison Control Center data highlighted in the sources reveals a troubling pattern. They've documented numerous severe intoxication incidents linked to specific energy drinks containing just 250 to 300 milligrams.
And these incidents disproportionately involve children and adolescents, right?
Yes, because they have lower body weights and less metabolic tolerance. They present with severe hypertension, intense jitteriness, agitation, tremors, vomiting.
Because the concentration and rapid consumption overwhelm the body's metabolic capacity.
Triggering a severe toxic reaction at doses far below the lethal threshold.
So that outlines the extreme of having too much. But clinically, what happens when a brain that is adapted to having its brakes continuously blocked suddenly has them put back on? Let's discuss caffeine withdrawal.
Let's do it.
I firmly believe this is a hidden epidemic. A vast number of listeners, and indeed clinicians, have probably experienced this syndrome without ever realizing what was happening.
I completely agree. It is incredibly prevalent, yet routinely misattributed to stress, a viral illness, or tension.
But it's a biological reality.
It is. Chronic daily consumption produces neuroadaptation physical dependence. The brain upregulates the number of adenosine receptors to try and restore the natural balance.
So when the caffeine intake is abruptly discontinued, all those extra receptors are suddenly flooded with adenosine.
And a characteristic, validated withdrawal syndrome rapidly emerges.
And the absolute hallmark symptom of this syndrome, the one that drives people back to the coffee machine, is the headache. But the literature describes it very specifically, doesn't it?
It's not just a mild, vague ache. The caffeine withdrawal headache is clinically distinct. It's typically described as a generalized, diffuse, throbbing headache.
And it's highly sensitive to movement.
Crucially sensitive. And notably worsened by the Valsalva maneuver. Any action that increases intrathoracic pressure coughing, straining, lifting heavy objects will exacerbate the vasodilation and cause the head to pound.
The timeline is also very predictable. The headache usually begins 12 to 24 hours after the last dose, and it peaks in intensity around 48 hours.
Right. But it's vital to note that the headache does not occur in isolation. The other validated DSM criteria include profound fatigue, severe difficulty concentrating, a dysphoric or depressed mood,
Irritability, and what are frequently described as flu-like symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, and diffuse muscle pain or stiffness.
The presence of those flea-like symptoms is often what throws clinicians off the scent. Patients assume they have contracted a viral gastroenteritis or a respiratory infection.
But here is the clinical pearl from the sources that truly shifts our understanding of the risk profile. You do not have to be consuming massive amounts of caffeine to experience this syndrome.
No, not at all. Withdrawal isn't exclusive to the patient drinking 6 shots of espresso a day.
The empirical data shows a clinically significant withdrawal syndrome can occur after stopping doses as low as 100 milligrams per day.
That's the equivalent of a single small cup of brewed coffee, or a couple of cups of tea.
Furthermore, physical dependence can develop rapidly, sometimes after just 3 days of consecutive moderate use.
3 days to neuroadaptation. When you factor in that low threshold, it illuminates a massive blind spot in hospital medicine, the post-operative headache phenomenon.
I found this part of the reading fascinating. For decades, it was a clinical mystery why so many patients suffered from severe, throbbing headaches immediately following elective surgeries.
Headaches entirely unrelated to the anesthesia or the surgical site.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how is the mystery solved?
By taking a caffeine history. Prior to surgery, a patient is instructed to remain nil per os nothing by mouth from midnight onwards.
Meaning they miss their routine morning coffee.
They undergo the surgery. By the time they are recovering in the post-anesthesia care unit, that 12 to 24-hour withdrawal window has arrived.
The patient is in agony, nauseous with a pounding headache.
And clinicians are ordering head CT scans or prescribing heavy analgesics when the diagnosis is simply acute caffeine withdrawal induced by surgical fasting.
A simple prophylactic dose of intravenous caffeine, or just allowing a preoperative cup of black coffee, can entirely prevent this morbidity.
It is a brilliant practical insight that underscores the importance of our mental models.
Now let's look at the other formal DSM diagnoses: caffeine-induced sleep disorder and caffeine-induced anxiety disorder.
These diagnoses are applied when the anxiety or sleep disturbance is severe enough to warrant independent clinical attention, and a thorough history establishes that caffeine is the primary etiological driver.
With sleep, the architecture is reliably altered, isn't it?
Yes. The closer caffeine is taken to bedtime, the more disruptive it is, delaying sleep onset, reducing total sleep time, and decreasing the quality of deep, slow-wave sleep.
But it's important to remember that because of the volatile half-life we discussed earlier, even caffeine consumed at noon can severely disrupt that evening sleep for sensitive individuals.
Which brings us back to genetics.
Right. Tolerance plays a role. We know regular users develop a partial tolerance to the sleep-disrupting and anxiety-provoking effects. But genetics seem paramount in dictating vulnerability.
Absolutely. The interindividual variability in susceptibility to caffeine-induced sleep disruption, and particularly anxiety and panic, is strongly associated with polymorphisms in the ADOR2A gene.
Recall that while CYP1A2 dictates how fast you clear the drug, the ADOR2A gene codes for the adenosine A2A receptor itself.
It determines your pharmacodynamic sensitivity. Your literal genetic makeup dictates how fiercely your central nervous system will react to having its inhibitory brakes removed.
So some genetic profiles make individuals exceptionally prone to severe anxiety after just a single cup.
Precisely.
Okay, so we have established intoxication, withdrawal, anxiety, and sleep disorders. But we need to address the most controversial category: addiction.
This is a critical diagnostic distinction.
How does the psychiatric community distinguish a dedicated, enthusiastic coffee lover from someone with a genuine psychiatric disorder? Everyone jokes about being addicted to coffee, but when does it become a pathology?
Let's unpack caffeine use disorder, or CUD. In the DSM-5-TR, it was placed in Section 3 as a condition for further study. It's defined as a cluster of physiological, behavioral, and psychological symptoms indicative of problematic use.
Coupled with a distinct difficulty controlling that use despite a sincere desire to do so.
Right. And what is vital for clinicians to grasp is that the proposed criteria for CUD were intentionally designed to be highly restrictive.
Restrictive in comparison to what?
If you examine the diagnostic criteria for general substance use disorders, like alcohol or cannabis use disorder, a patient only needs to meet 2 out of 11 possible criteria to receive a diagnosis of a mild disorder.
Both caffeine.
The work group recognized that because consumption is so ubiquitous, applying that low threshold would pathologize millions of normal consumers. Therefore, they proposed that 3 specific, stringent criteria are absolutely mandatory to make the diagnosis of CUD.
Let's list those 3 mandatory criteria, because they really separate the habit from the pathology. First, there must be a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control caffeine use.
Second, there must be continued caffeine use despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by it.
And third, the presence of characteristic withdrawal symptoms.
The combination is key. It's not enough to simply experience a withdrawal headache when you miss a dose. That just proves physical dependence, which is expected.
To have a use disorder, you must actively want to quit, be repeatedly failing in your attempts to quit, and be actively damaging your physical or mental health in the process.
It requires a loss of control resulting in functional impairment.
To ground this in clinical reality, let's deeply examine the textbook case provided in the sources, the case of Mrs. E.
She is a 32-year-old woman working full-time as a manager.
Her daily consumption consists of 4 to 5 mugs of regular brewed coffee. She spaces them out, but takes her first mug just 5 minutes after waking up.
Now, on the surface, her pattern sounds indistinguishable from half the modern workforce.
Right. So where does her case cross the threshold into a psychiatric disorder?
The pathology reveals itself when we look at the negative consequences and her profound inability to alter her behavior. Mrs. E's primary care physicians had explicitly and repeatedly recommended that she stop drinking coffee.
Because she was suffering from chronic, uncomfortable indigestion and reflux.
Exactly. She understood the medical advice but found herself entirely unable to comply. The habit was too deeply entrenched.
Furthermore, her use was leading to hazardous situations. She insisted on drinking hot coffee while driving her car, which led to a spill and a physical burn.
So we have the continued use despite a known physical problem, the indigestion, and unsuccessful efforts to control it.
But the true severity of her condition emerged when she finally attempted an abrupt cessation.
When she stopped abruptly, the withdrawal syndrome was incapacitating. She rated her resulting headache as a 12 out of 10 on a pain scale.
Wow. and she developed severe muscle aches, profound lethargy, and inability to concentrate.
Crucially, this caused significant occupational impairment. She was forced to leave work 2 hours early, go home, and go to bed hours earlier than her usual routine. She was functionally crippled by the absence of the drug.
And what is the tragic, defining characteristic of addiction? After enduring that horrific withdrawal, after missing work, she returned to her usual pattern of consuming 4 to 5 mugs a day.
She could not sustain the cessation. That is the essence of a use disorder.
The compulsive return to the substance despite known medical harm and severe distress upon cessation. Mrs. E vividly illustrates why this syndrome represents a genuine loss of behavioral control that warrants formal study.
Yes, even if it lacks the devastating social destruction of severe alcohol or opioid addiction.
So, synthesizing all of this, the history, the volatile pharmacokinetics, the adenosine mechanism, and the stringent diagnostic criteria, what does this mean for the clinician sitting in a consultation room?
We are moving into the integration and clinical reasoning phase, because if this substance is so deeply woven into daily life, it must hide in plain sight during psychiatric evaluations.
It is the ultimate diagnostic blind spot. Clinicians frequently fail to take a detailed, quantified caffeine history.
It simply doesn't register on their radar in the same way alcohol, cannabis, or illicit stimulants do. But in clinical practice, caffeine is the great mimicker.
I love that phrase, the great mimicker. What is it mimicking most often?
When a patient presents to a psychiatric clinic with new onset generalized anxiety, frequent panic attacks, or primary insomnia, a meticulous caffeine history is an absolute prerequisite.
You cannot accurately diagnose or effectively treat a primary anxiety disorder if the patient is unknowingly consuming 800 milligrams of a potent adenosine antagonist every day.
Exactly. The caffeine may be the sole cause of the symptoms, or it may be drastically exacerbating an underlying psychiatric vulnerability. Until you remove the drug, the true baseline is obscured.
Are there specific psychiatric populations that are more vulnerable to heavy use? Do we see caffeine clustering with other conditions?
The epidemiological data synthesizes this clearly. Heavy caffeine use strongly clusters with other psychiatric and substance use disorders. It's found at exceptionally high rates among individuals with schizophrenia.
Often leading to severe sleep dysregulation, I'd imagine.
Yes. Furthermore, heavy caffeine use is intimately associated with cigarette smoking, alcohol use disorders, and other substance use disorders.
Is that purely a behavioral clustering? People who like one drug tend to like others, or is there a biological basis?
There is a profound biological basis. Twin studies using multivariate structural equation modeling have indicated that a shared underlying polysubstance use genetic factor strongly influences the use of caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine.
So there appears to be a shared familial genetic vulnerability to seeking out these neurochemical alterations.
But beyond the genetics, there is a direct, critical pharmacokinetic interaction between caffeine and cigarette smoking. This is perhaps the most important clinical trap a psychiatrist must understand.
Let's dive deep into that smoking interaction, because this is where the biochemistry directly impacts patient care. We established earlier that the CYP1A2 enzyme in the liver clears caffeine. How does smoking alter that?
Well, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons found in cigarette smoke are potent inducers of the CYP1A2 enzyme system.
Induction, meaning they force the liver to produce more of the enzyme and work much faster.
Exactly. Because of this induction, chronic cigarette smokers metabolize caffeine nearly twice as fast as non-smokers.
Therefore, to achieve the same subjective feeling of alertness, a smoker is compelled to consume significantly larger quantities of caffeine throughout the day.
So the smoker naturally scales up their coffee intake just to maintain baseline. But here is the clinical trap. What happens when that patient, perhaps on the advice of their doctor, decides to quit smoking abruptly?
The biochemical shift is rapid and dramatic.
Yes. When the patient stops smoking, the steady supply of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons ceases. Within a matter of days, the CYP1A2 enzyme activity slows back down to a normal, uninduced baseline.
However, if the patient does not simultaneously and drastically reduce their coffee intake,
they are now pouring the same massive amount of caffeine into a liver that is processing it at half the speed.
the caffeine levels will literally skyrocket in their bloodstream.
Exactly. Their blood plasma levels of caffeine can double or triple within days. This sudden, massive accumulation of an adenosine antagonist will precipitate severe, acute anxiety.
Profound jitteriness, tachycardia, and insomnia.
And the tragic irony is how this is usually interpreted. The patient, and very often their clinician, will look at this sudden onset of severe anxiety and insomnia and conclude, wow, nicotine withdrawal is incredibly severe for this patient.
They are having terrible anxiety from quitting smoking. But it's not the lack of nicotine causing those specific symptoms.
No, it is acute caffeine intoxication. It perfectly mimics severe nicotine withdrawal or a primary anxiety episode.
And what is the typical behavioral response? The patient, desperate to calm their racing heart and anxiety, relapses and starts smoking again.
The smoking reinduces the liver enzymes, the caffeine is cleared faster, the anxiety resolves, and the patient falsely believes they need cigarettes for their mental health.
In reality, they simply needed to cut their coffee intake in half when they quit smoking. Failing to understand this mechanism leads to countless failed smoking cessation attempts.
It's a phenomenal aha moment that completely reshapes how you manage a patient's recovery.
Finally, in terms of integration, where does the psychiatrist need to collaborate with primary care? What are the medical contraindications for caffeine that might necessitate a conversation about reducing intake?
The primary intersection points involve cardiovascular medicine, gastroenterology, and obstetrics. While tolerance develops to many cardiovascular effects, modest blood pressure increases are noted in non-tolerant users.
And the consumption of unfiltered coffee, like French press or espresso, can elevate serum cholesterol due to compounds called diterpenes.
In gastroenterology, caffeine is a known trigger for gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, as we saw with Miss E, and it can exacerbate urinary incontinence. But perhaps the most critical collaborative conversation involves pregnancy.
Right, connecting back to that volatile half-life we discussed earlier.
Exactly. Because caffeine clearance slows down drastically by more than 50%, by the 24th week of pregnancy, fetal exposure is significantly prolonged.
While the data can be complex, the sources highlight potential, albeit modest, dose-dependent links between higher daily caffeine use and delayed conception, higher rates of miscarriage, and lower birth weight.
For women who are pregnant or attempting to conceive, advising them on the mechanics of delayed clearance and guiding a gradual reduction in intake is a critical, cross-disciplinary medical intervention that psychiatrists should actively support.
Let's step back and survey the immense landscape we've just covered. We began with Medlock Holmes in a café, observing a culturally celebrated ritual, and we have deconstructed it down to its neurobiological core.
We covered a lot of ground.
Let me attempt to synthesize the key takeaways from our journey through Chapter 11.4 today. First, caffeine is a potent, dose-dependent selective antagonist of adenosine receptors.
Right. It does not magically grant the brain more energy. It fundamentally alters brain function by blocking the neurochemical signal for cellular exhaustion.
It disconnects the brakes, indirectly enhancing dopamine signaling in the process. Second, its journey through the body, its pharmacokinetics, is highly volatile and individualized.
The half-life is massively influenced by genetics, interacting medications like oral contraceptives, and particularly cigarette smoking, which rapidly speeds up its clearance.
Third, caffeine withdrawal is not a myth, a joke, or a sign of weakness. It is a biologically validated syndrome of neuroadaptation.
It features severe, throbbing headaches worsened by the Valsalva maneuver, alongside flu-like symptoms, and it is entirely capable of causing severe functional impairment even at low daily doses, such as in the postoperative fasting patient.
And finally, clinicians must actively look for this blind spot. Because it is so ubiquitous, it is the great mimicker in psychiatry.
A thorough, quantified caffeine history must be a mandatory component in the differential diagnosis for any patient presenting with anxiety, panic, or sleep disorders, particularly those attempting to quit smoking.
That is an excellent comprehensive synthesis of the core mental models we aim to build for the listener. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over based on everything we've just discussed.
Oh, this should be good.
Given what the psychiatric and medical communities now know unequivocally about caffeine's mechanism of action, its ability to cause physical dependence, debilitating withdrawal, acute toxicity, and its complex genetic variability.
If the caffeine molecule were discovered in a laboratory today for the very first time, how would global regulatory agencies schedule it?
Exactly. Would it be poured freely in every workplace break room? And most importantly, would a known central nervous system stimulant ever be allowed to be added to artificially flavored beverages heavily marketed to 2 to 5-year-old children?
It is something to seriously consider the next time you hear that kettle whistle in the dark.
Now, let's test the mental models we've built with some clinical reasoning. We're going to run through some single best answer questions based directly on the material in Chapter 11.4 of Kaplan and Sadok.
I will present the clinical scenario or question. I'll pause briefly to let you lock in your answer, and then we will unpack the rationale.
Question 1, focusing on mechanism. Which of the following is the primary cellular mechanism responsible for the central nervous system stimulant effects of caffeine at typical human doses? We'll pause for a second.
The answer is antagonism of adenosine A1 and A2A receptors. Caffeine structurally mimics the endogenous neuromodulator adenosine, occupying its receptors without activating them.
By blocking adenosine, which normally reduces spontaneous electrical activity and promotes sleepiness, caffeine removes the inhibitory tone, indirectly leading to central nervous system stimulation. It acts as a brake block, not an accelerator.
All right. Question 2, focusing on pharmacokinetics and clinical integration. A 30-year-old patient who consumes 4 cups of brewed coffee daily decides to abruptly quit smoking cigarettes.
If their daily coffee intake remains completely unchanged, what is the most likely pharmacokinetic consequence over the following week? Take a moment.
The answer is the half-life and plasma concentration of caffeine will significantly increase. This occurs because the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in cigarette smoke heavily induce the CYP1A2 enzyme system.
When the patient stops smoking, the enzyme activity slows back down to its uninduced baseline. With the same caffeine input but a much slower clearance rate, caffeine levels will accumulate rapidly, potentially leading to severe anxiety or insomnia that mimics nicotine withdrawal.
Question 3, diving into clinical manifestations. A patient presents 24 hours after an elective abdominal surgery with a severe throbbing headache that is highly sensitive to movement and exacerbated by bearing down, along with nausea and diffuse muscle stiffness.
What historical detail is most crucial to confirm the likely diagnosis? Have a think.
The answer is the patient's preoperative daily caffeine consumption. This is a classic, frequently mispresentation of a caffeine withdrawal headache exacerbated by surgical fasting, the nil per os orders.
The headache typically peaks at 48 hours and is often accompanied by those flu-like symptoms. Eliciting a history of routine morning coffee confirms the physical dependence underlying the postoperative morbidity.
Question 4, looking at genetics and vulnerability. Variability in an individual's susceptibility to caffeine-induced anxiety, panic, and sleep disruption is most strongly associated with polymorphisms in which specific gene. Think about that one.
The answer is the ADOR-A2A gene. It is vital to distinguish this from CYP1A2. While the CYP1A2 gene dictates pharmacokinetics, how fast you metabolize the drug, the ADOR-A2A gene codes for the adenosine A2A receptor itself.
Genetic variations here strongly dictate a person's pharmacodynamic sensitivity, making some individuals highly vulnerable to the anxiety-provoking effects of having their adenosine receptors blocked.
And our final question, question 5, on nosology and the nuances of caffeine use disorder. According to the DSM-5-TR proposed criteria for caffeine use disorder, which of the following criteria is absolutely mandatory for the diagnosis, distinguishing it from the lower thresholds of general substance use disorder criteria? Let's give you a second.
The answer is continued caffeine use despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem likely caused or exacerbated by caffeine.
The DSM-5-TR workgroup intentionally made the proposed criteria highly restrictive to avoid pathologizing normal consumers.
Along with withdrawal and unsuccessful efforts to cut down, continuing to use despite known medical harm, such as the worsening GRD in the textbook case of Mrs. E, is a mandatory requirement to demonstrate true functional impairment and loss of control.
Fantastic. We strongly encourage you to read alongside Chapter 11.4 of Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry to truly solidify these frameworks in your own clinical reasoning. Here are the details in this episode.
Caffeine-related disorders. Byline. The world's favorite stimulant rarely announces itself as an addiction. Sometimes the greatest mystery hides inside the most ordinary morning ritual.